Shall we go ahead and begin? All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this session of a series of talks that we have organized called Past Imperfect, which is brought to you by the Center for Wisdom and Leadership at SPJIMR. This particular book series looks at how histories of business and politics, books that have recently been written on these topics with regard to India and with regard to India and the wider world as well, how such books can help us better understand concept of wisdom and leadership more broadly defined. So in business, administration, politics, what have you. And the books that we've brought together for the series cover a range of topics. We had a book about 2 weeks ago on the Tatas with Mircea Eliade, and the remaining 2 books that we have, one looks at individuals who have absconded from India to places like London due to various questions in their financial dealings, and the last book looks at technical and engineering education in India and its historical development. So we have quite a diverse mix of books to bring you here. And today's book is by Vinay Sitapati. The book is called Half Lion, a biography of P.V. Narasimha Rao, the Prime Minister. And Vinay is an associate professor of political science and the head of the Department of Political Science at Ashoka University. He completed his PhD at Princeton, and his most recent book, Jugalbandi, which is a book on the history of friendship and political cooperation between Vajpayee and Advani, was published in 2020 and was actually just yesterday longlisted for a book prize, the Kamala Devi Chaddapadhyay Book Prize run by the New India Foundation. The book that we will cover today came out, as I said, in 2016, and it was the first real in-depth biography of Rao and his consequential and utterly transformative years being Prime Minister. And now is a good moment to remember him, given that it's been 30 years since that first push for reforms that he put in place in 1991. I'm going to give a short quote from the book, and then I'll hand it over to Vinay. So here's a description of Rao in comparison to other world leaders. In terms of the quantum of transformation brought about, Rao ranks with other 20th century revolutionary figures such as Jawaharlal Nehru of India, Deng Xiaoping of China, Franklin D. Roosevelt and Ronald Reagan of the United States, Margaret Thatcher of Great Britain, and Charles de Gaulle of France. But these leaders had advantages that Rao did not. Unlike Deng, Narasimha Rao operated in a fractious democracy with severe limits on his powers. Unlike FDR and de Gaulle, Rao lacked charisma and popular support. And in contrast to Reagan, Thatcher, and Nehru, Rao did not control parliament or even his own party. That he survived is itself noteworthy. That he did much more than survive is short of a miracle. This is a particularly fascinating figure. I mean, this is someone who is described by Jairam Ramesh as having the charisma of a dead fish, and yet he spoke 10 languages, he mastered 2 computer languages, and utterly transformed India's economy. So with that, I'll hand it over to Vinay, who will give a short presentation, and then we'll have questions and answers.
Thank you very much. What Dinyar didn't mention in his lengthy introduction was that there's another person who's on the screen who has also been shortlisted for the award that he mentioned, and that's Dinyar Patel himself. He's not only is he modest, but he's also a great biographer. I would strongly recommend his book on Navroji. In fact, I do think I've contributed something to the sales because I keep giving it to people saying that this is how you can write a slim biography that actually shows why it has taken a decade to write. It's both deep as well as accessible, and getting the mix of those right is very hard. So thank you, Dinyar. With your permission, I'm going to just share my screen. Can all of you see this and hear me? Everyone? Okay. So thank you for inviting me to SPJIMR. I'm a Bombay boy, so I grew up with, if you don't get into SPJIMR, what's going to happen kind of thing. So I'm happy, to address all of you. I'm also happy that this is the Center for Wisdom and Leadership. There are many ways in which I can tell the Narasimha Rao story. There's a structural, there's a policy account, there's a narrative on economic reforms. But because, the focus here is on personality, on leadership traits, That's what I'm going to speak about for the next 10 to 12 minutes. So the book, of course, has much more than that, right? It's also a story of India changing. It's a story of political economy in India, right? When did reforms happen? But that's not what I'm going to talk about. If you have questions, I'm happy to answer it. Instead, I'm going to focus on the personality traits that Narasimha Rao possessed and what are the leadership lessons we can learn from him in areas very different from politics. For example, many of you will, join the corporate world or business, but the lessons that last, last nonetheless. So the book came out in 2016. It's been translated into lots of languages. It was published academically in the US by Oxford University Press. It's also available in an audiobook in English if you want to hear. Now, just to introduce Narasimha Rao to you, I want to take you back to the year 1985. Indira Gandhi has just been killed and her son Rajiv Gandhi has become prime minister. Rajiv Gandhi is young, he's educated abroad, he speaks English, he surrounds himself with people who are conversant with computers, who have corporate sector education, people, who are anglicized, people like Manishankar Iyer, Arun Nehru, etc., right? Narasimha Rao has been, a lifelong congressman. He's been a minister under Indira Gandhi. He is as far removed from the social world of Rajiv Gandhi as possible. I mean, he wears a dhoti. He does speak 10 languages, but I think English is the fourth or fifth language he knows, right? It's not the first, second, or even third language he knows, right? And so he comes from a social world as far removed from Rajiv Gandhi. So Rajiv Gandhi is just prime minister and Narasimha Rao is worried, will he have the same cabinet berths, foreign ministry, home ministry that Indira Gandhi gave him under the new boss, right? And so it's sometime around 1985 and there's this large room and Narasimha Rao is sitting in the room and he overhears Rajiv Gandhi telling some friends of his. So the conversation is not directed at Narasimha Rao. Rajiv Gandhi is telling some friends of his that, look, we need to reduce restrictions on the import of computers, right? But the old fogies in my cabinet will not understand. So think of what Rajiv Gandhi tells some of his cronies. We need to remove import restrictions on computers. This is the license quota permit era Raj. But the old fogies in my cabinet will not understand, right? Narasimha Rao goes home that day, calls up his son, who's an engineer in Hyderabad, and said, what is this computer? Send me a prototype. Next day, computer is sent to Narasimha Rao. In the following weeks, he buys manuals for computing. And in that year and the next, he learns BASIC, he learns Linux, I think, and he also learns to code in Unix. Think about it. This is India, this is 1985, and this is a dhoti-clad man who would one day become Prime Minister of India. Now, I love this story when I heard it because it captured the essence of the personality of Narasimha Rao. And the main feature is he understood the alignment of political stars at any point of time, right? It's a stray remark, but he understands there that, look, Rajiv Gandhi doesn't want, old timers like Pranab Mukherjee, for example, who are very close to Indira Gandhi. He wants a younger lot, right? And Narasimha Rao refashions himself. And not only does he get back in favor with Rajiv Gandhi, he becomes foreign minister again, he becomes HRD minister again. And as we all know, in 1991, he becomes Prime Minister of India. Now, I began working on this book, as Dinyar will tell you, scholarship involves first doing secondary research. So I read everything people had written about the 90s, India changing in the 90s, on defense, on economic policy, etc., etc. I also did a lot of interviews, right? More than 100 interviews. And these weren't just interviews with Manmohan Singh, who was Narasimha Rao's finance minister. They were with his doctor, right? The doctor knew his pulse when Narasimha Rao was seeing the fall of the Babri Masjid on television, for example. His cook, who told me that Narasimha Rao's favorite vegetable was karela or bitter gourd, which if you think about it, kind of suits the man's personality, right? His secretary, his diplomats. So I got his godman, Chandraswamy, who I interviewed. So I spent a lot of time saying, if you want to understand a human being, and I think this is pretty important for those, associated with the Center for Wisdom and Leadership, that wisdom is deciphered not just by looking at the public persona of the person, but also their private lives, right? How they treat their driver, right? What is their wisdom when they're playing a sport, right? What is their relationship with their family, right? All of that gives you a sense of leadership, not just that confined to the public sphere. I then got lucky. Narasimha Rao's family opened up his archives. I think there were, if my memory serves, about 45 cartons of papers. He was a very lonely man. So he, on his computer, he used to write a diary entry. So the diary entry you see on the left is the day after Rajiv Gandhi has been assassinated. Narasimha Rao has at that time retired from politics. He's been denied a Lok Sabha ticket and has accepted the position of the head monk of the Kotralam monastery in southern Tamil Nadu. He's going to become a spiritual guru, right? And suddenly he realizes that Rajiv Gandhi has been murdered. And he also realizes that by virtue of being the least charismatic, least threatening man in the Congress, he is now positioned to be prime minister, right? And when you read my book, you'll see how he then, this man who was going to be a monk, then maneuvers to become prime minister of India, right? Now, let me get to the story itself. The year is June 1991, right? Narasimha Rao has just become prime minister and he inherits an inbox from hell. His Congress predecessor, Rajiv Gandhi, has just been assassinated. That's the photo of the dead body on the left bottom in Sri Perumbudur near Chennai, right? The Soviet Union is in a state of collapse. And, many of you may not remember this, right? Or even been born that, the Soviet Union was India's biggest ally, in the UN on the world stage. It was our biggest defense supplier. And so, in 1991, for example, a majority of our MiG, attack fighters couldn't take off because the spare parts were in Ukraine, where there was a revolution taking place, right? So the fall of the Soviet Union really hit India's sense of self, right? That's the photo you see on the right bottom. India was also ungovernable, right? Elections could not be conducted in Punjab. I also think it wasn't conducted in Kashmir because of fear of secession. And most important of all, India faced in June 1991 an economic catastrophe. India did not have enough money to pay for its oil imports. In order to borrow money, it had to pledge its gold in the RBI reserves, which IMF would then take to the Bank of England, and only then the money would come. So not only was the gold to be pledged, but the gold had to be physically taken, right, from India all the way to England. It's humiliating, right? The photo you see at the top there is guarded buses taking these pieces of gold to Sahar Airport in Bombay, from which they go to England. And it really brought home to many Indians that we literally were selling our family silver. To top it all, Narasimha Rao was a minority government. The Congress did not have a majority in parliament, right? And to give you an example of that, 2 governments before Narasimha Rao and 3 governments after Narasimha Rao all collapsed barely within a year because they were all minority governments. So we are looking at unstable India. And finally, Narasimha Rao had, as Dinyar mentioned, the charisma of a dead fish. The Congress didn't particularly like him. They saw him as a placeholder for Sonia Gandhi or Rahul Gandhi when he grew up. That was the India he inherited. In the middle of that, not only did Narasimha Rao survive for 5 full years, which is I find quite astonishing, and I show you how he survived, but he also was able to transform the Indian economy, transform welfare schemes in India. So I have a whole chapter on how, the first national employment guarantee scheme, the first national health scheme, all of that came during Narasimha Rao. So he wasn't just an economic liberalizer. He also believed in using the increase in tax revenue for large welfare schemes, something that every government, central or state in India, has accepted since. He navigated the collapse of the Soviet Union and the reorientation of Indian foreign policy. And he did this all by surviving, right? He made plenty of mistakes. I talk about Babri Masjid in detail. I talk about his role as home minister during the Sikh riots. The book is not a hagiography at all, right? But I can't imagine any other political figure doing so much with so little. And that brings us to the question, that is before me here, and I think, is linked to the Center for Wisdom and Leadership, saying, what personality traits did he possess to come up with this kind of leadership? And the answer of the book is that Narasimha Rao had an ability to play a lion when it was required, to lose gracefully when was required, and to lie and cheat when required, right? So for example, he realized that India needed to open up the domestic airline industry. The first private airlines flight, I think it was Jet Airways, took out in 1993, a direct result of his policies. So he pushed back against Air India. At the same time, he knew that if Air India employees went on strike, took to the streets, any privatization would not take place, any liberalization would not take place. So he swore that not a single Air India employee will be sacked. He just stopped new recruitment because he knew that potential recruits couldn't trouble him. Existing employees could, right? So he was a lion, a mouse, and a fox. And through the book, you will see that there are three aspects of his personality that enabled him to play, to put it differently, he knew how to be an opening batsman, a middle over batsman, and a Dhoni kind of death batsman, right? That's the kind of quality he had. And the reason he had this are three. And I think these three reasons apply for leadership everywhere. The first thing is that good leaders tend to have a broad range of experiences and perspectives, right? So even in whatever organization you all join or work in, it's not enough just to know the law side or just to know the marketing side or just to know the sales side, right? You should have some experience of marketing, sales, of the product itself, of technology. You should have a smattering of what the law is. You should know what the consumer thinks. Narasimha Rao, for example, was the only Prime Minister of India, I think bar two, who had been both Chief Minister and a Union Minister before being Prime Minister. Now I leave you to figure out who are the other two, right? Narendra Modi, for example, understood how Gujarat worked, and as you know, in the Indian federal system, law and order, lots of education, development of certain kinds come within the Chief Minister's ambit. But neither Amit Shah nor Narendra Modi knew how Delhi worked. They didn't know foreign policy. Frankly, they didn't know economic policy, right? And the Nehru Gandhis know how Delhi works, right? Whether it was Nehru, it was Indira Gandhi or Rajiv, but they had never held either a chief minister or a state minister's position, right? So they don't understand that aspect of the government. So on the left top, you see Narasimha Rao as Chief Minister of Andhra Pradesh. At the right bottom, you see his Union Defense Minister. He had held so many positions at so many levers of government, right, before becoming Prime Minister. He was also a legislator who had campaigned in 3 different states in India and one as an MP, campaigning in 3 different languages. In Behrampur, Odisha, he campaigned in Odia. In near Nagpur, he campaigned in Maharashtra. He was an MP from Maharashtra. And of course, he was an MP from what is today Telangana. So a man with a wide view of India, right? A wide view of Indian government, right? So this is, to put it pretty simply, experience matters and breadth matters, because we are all into specialization, specialization, specialization. Narasimha Rao tells you that a generalist and somebody with breadth, right, is an important personality skill to succeed as a leader. The second is leaders need to spy on everybody. Now, this is not a nice thing to say, but Narasimha Rao did it, right? It's, if you're a boss, you should know what the water cooler gossip is. You may choose not to act on it, but you should know what it is. So Narasimha Rao kept Intelligence Bureau reports on everybody, right? I found, for example, in his, among his papers, an IB report that his enemy within the Congress, Arjun Singh, had bought land in Bhopal and details of the land transaction, right? So that's the second aspect of Chandraswamy. He kept tabs on everybody. He had a godman like Chandraswamy with contacts in different parties. He may not act on it, right? But he certainly knew what was going on. The third quality of Narasimha Rao, which I think is quite remarkable, was he was both a thinker and somebody who acts, right? Now, if you look at the Western canon, the typical literary character who acts without thinking is Don Quixote, who kind of goes to windmills, but he's not using his brain. And the typical literary character who thinks, not acts, is, as you can imagine, Hamlet, right? Who's so sort of indecisive that he just struggles to act. Narasimha Rao was both. He knew when to stop thinking and when to act, and when to act and stop thinking. He was a scholar. You see him there wearing his lungi reading. That's the famous article, Clash of Civilization by Samuel Huntington. And these are his detailed notes on the left, right? So he was very much the intellectual, and everybody gives him credit for that. He knew 10 languages. But you know what? He also was somebody who knew how to act. And as I detail in the book on economic reforms, he moved with lightning speed. You know, when he was Chief Minister of Andhra Pradesh, the photo that you see on the top left, he brought about the most far-ranging land reforms that India had seen. That it failed is a separate question, and I talk about it in the book. And finally, he is the father of India's nuclear program, as Atal Bihari Vajpayee himself said. That's a photo of Narasimha Rao with the two people who ran India's nuclear program. One of them, you all know, APJ Abdul Kalam, who was the secretary of the top secret nuclear weapons committee, nuclear program in India. The chairman, an unsung hero, Naresh Chandra, is on the left top, right? So Narasimha Rao also knew how to act. And so leaders should know how to think and make ideas. It's not just that you should act all the time, but you should also know how to make decisions and carry it through. So that's it. I think I've crossed 15 minutes. Dinyar, all for you, questions for you, and I'm looking forward to questions from the audience. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much, Vinay, for that overview. And as someone who's read the book, I can tell you that obviously is just a skim through the surface. There's so much more that's covered in the book, not just about Rao's transformative role as Prime Minister, of course, but also his earlier political avatars and the various different activities that he was involved in. As well. It's really quite an incredible figure that you've had a chance to investigate. So I wanted to begin with just a few questions, and then we can open it up to question and answers. And for those of you who are on this call as audience members, feel free to put questions in the Q&A box that is available to you. So my first question is this. I mean, so you've talked about how Rao was consequently was really someone who really lacked a power base, right? I mean, he lacked, those common elements that really make many other, leaders, not just in Indian history, but history of anywhere in the world. And to what degree was this lack of power, as well as a lack of charisma, really an asset for Rao? In what ways did he use it for his own good?
So it was an asset. I think there's no question, right? And Dinyar, for those of you who read newspapers, I just have two words for you: Bhupendra Patel, right? Why on earth is Bhupendra Patel the new chief minister of Gujarat, right? So one answer is his caste, like who are we kidding, right? But there's another answer, right? And that is that he threatens nobody, and you keep, and by the way, this is even more heightened in the Congress party, because the Congress party, Dinyar, as you know, is structured as factions. And then you have a high command which actually encourages these factions so that they'll keep cutting each other to size. So if Sachin Pilot gets too big, you give power to Gehlot. If Gehlot gets too big, Rahul Gandhi will give power to Sachin Pilot. If Amrinder Singh is getting too big for his boots, you give power to Navjot Singh Sidhu. This is politics, and especially in the Congress party, right? And so what happens is, when the question about who should become chief minister comes, any faction leader becomes, the head, then if the rest of the other faction protests. So what they require is the classic Indian phrase, a compromise candidate. That's like the delightful Indian phrase, right? Paneer Selvam, right, is another very good example. And you end up with Narasimha Rao as the classic compromise candidate. Now, I don't think he deliberately set off to do it, right? Because as I point out, he came of age when Brahmins were dominating the then Andhra Congress, right? Now Telangana Congress, but then Andhra Congress. But very quickly that transformed into the Brahmins being reduced to the numerical percentage of their population, and the Congress being Reddis, Khammas, various other castes and communities, right? And so the very fact that he was Brahmin, he had a small percentage. That's not his doing, but that meant that he couldn't really have a mass caste base, right? Second is, he was completely non-charismatic. Again, he didn't do it by design. That was his personality. But that meant that, unlike, say, someone like Y.S. Rajashekar Reddy or even Narendra Modi, he could not capture the imagination of the people on a regional basis. He couldn't do any of that, right? But he was he was an effective parliamentarian. He knew where the wind was. He knew how to listen to his boss. So it turned out to be an asset. Dinyar, it was also an asset in a second way, which is, I think leaders at the very top tend to be lonely, whether you are gregarious or not. The position is a lonely one. Narasimha Rao was lonely since childhood. So by the time he became chief minister, and then, as he rose higher and higher in politics, where loneliness comes with the job, he had been used to that his whole life. If somebody told, when you become prime minister, you should trust nobody. Well, Narasimha Rao didn't trust anyone from a child, right? So on both these counts, it proved an asset. He obviously realized it, but I don't think that it was deliberately crafted in that sense.
Great. Yeah, I mean, there's a particular genre of political leaders that Rao in many ways kind of highlights. These transformative figures who were not expected to, bring about transformation, right? I mean, one person I was just thinking of who's rather similar from another national context is Juan Carlos of Spain, the former king of Spain, who, Francisco Franco, the fascist dictator, puts him in charge of things, and then once Franco is dead, there goes fascism, and Spain reverts to becoming a constitutional monarchy. So I'm going to not go with the second question as yet, because it looks like we have a lot of questions in Q&A. So let me take one from Harish Shetty. So why, you'll enjoy this, why was he rejected by his own party heads, especially if he was so successful?
You mean his party subsequently, right?
I imagine that's probably,
I think there's one word answer. Sonia Gandhi doesn't like him. I mean, this is a simple answer. And again, it's, and to be fair to Sonia Gandhi, it's because Narasimha Rao spent a lot of effort as prime minister, especially after about mid-1992, trying to de-link the Nehru Gandhis from the Congress party, right? He was spying on Sonia Gandhi. Like, I saw IB reports with who is coming to meet Sonia Gandhi, who is not. He was spying on Sonia Gandhi. I mean, I stand by the phrase. In fact, when the book came out, that was the front page Indian Express headline, right? So he gave just cause. I mean, if you were taking Narasimha Rao's side, you'd say, look, Sonia Gandhi is a private citizen. Narasimha Rao is the duly elected Prime Minister of India. Why should he kowtow to Sonia Gandhi, right? But if you were a supporter of Sonia Gandhi, you would say, look, Narasimha Rao is a nobody, right? The 1991 vote was a sympathy vote for Rajiv Gandhi, which was vested in the widow of Rajiv Gandhi, Sonia. And the party itself thought of Sonia Gandhi as the leader of the party. And it was because of Sonia Gandhi that Narasimha Rao was chosen to begin with, right? And when that didn't happen, I think, Sonia Gandhi, Rahul Gandhi feel that, Narasimha Rao should be de-linked from the party. I think there's a second more insidious reason. I think the first reason is understandable. The second reason is that if the Congress party admits that you can have a successful prime minister who's not a Nehru Gandhi, it begs the obvious question, right? Which is why when I began the book, Narasimha Rao's, photo isn't there in 24 Akbar Road when I visited. Astonishing, right? He was the living blood of the party for decades, right? He was Congress president for the entire period he was in the party. It's like one of those Stalinist erasures, right? When I went to the Congress party website then, I don't know what they've done now, they have a chapter on liberalization, and Narasimha Rao's name was absent. I mean, it's unbelievable, right? That I think it's fair to say, look, Rajiv Gandhi thought of some of the ideas. If he hadn't died, maybe he would have implemented it. Manmohan Singh played a critical part, which he absolutely did. But to deny the political leader, right, is like saying that Deng had no role in the transformation of China, right? And I think that, and frankly, if you ask me on balance, I think it has hurt the Congress.
Great. Yeah, I mean, again, a great example of how history is ultimately a very political thing, especially here in India. So I'm going to take a question from an anonymous attendee who asks about the mistakes of Narasimha Rao. If you could talk about one of them, or if you want to talk about,
but
in general.
Instead of talking about them in detail, let me list them because there were many, right? I think the first unforgivable mistake is that he was home minister in 1984, during the Sikh riots, right? He knew what was going to happen, and he was bypassed by the PMO. Many of you know that Delhi, being a unique kind of state, the police report to the national home minister, right? Not the state home minister, and that was Narasimha Rao. And Narasimha Rao, he knew that riots were going to happen the next day. So October 31st evening, he's in his office. Indira Gandhi has just been murdered. He gets reports that, a pogrom is planned against Sikhs. But he also gets a phone call from the PMO, from somebody very close to the PM, saying that, look, there are going to be riots tomorrow. You may not be able to handle it. So let it be handled from the PM, right? Not by the PM, but from the PMO, right? And now I'm not speculating about the motive or whether it was law and order or if it was more insidious. But Narasimha Rao agrees to that, right? And the next day, the day after, as thousands of Sikhs are being murdered, he does nothing, right? And he does nothing because to do something then would mean that he may not make it to the next cabinet, Rajiv Gandhi's cabinet, right? Now, in doing this, he did what every other Congress person was doing at that time, right? The difference is he was the one with the executive office to actually do something. So I think that's a big error. Babri Masjid, I'm much more kind and favorable to him. I think that the idea that he connived with Advani is rubbish. There's no evidence. There's a ton of evidence he tried to do otherwise, right? But he failed to do it. And he failed to do it because his own political calculation was that he knew that the game in Babri Masjid was not just the demolition of Babri Masjid, but it was the demolition of Narasimha Rao, that even his own congressman wanted to eject him as prime minister. And he chose political survival over protection of the mosque, right? Again, there I would say that when the time came for him to be a statesman, he chose to act as a politician. But everything else is just a complete invention with no evidence that he was actually an RSS man. I spent tons of time I think that was the second error, right? Now, I think a third error he made was that around 94, 95, he began to give up on economic reforms, right? I think until then, here was the former monk who had nothing to lose, and wanted to and had this deep civilizational idea of India, right? That was, he was a very religious scholar. He was a translator in Telugu, a translator in Hindi. He knew how to write in English. So he had this deep civilizational idea of India, the deep cultural idea of India, and he had nothing to lose, which enabled him to push for economic liberalization, changing Indian foreign policy. But I think after late 94, early 95, he became greedy for power. He imagined coming to power a second time, right? And he then became much more cautious and much more of a conventional politician. So again, there are other mistakes, but if I were to headline them, these would be the three big errors. Also to kind of convince you that the book is far from a hagiography.
We have another question. Someone wants to know more about the spiritual side of Rao. What role was played, if any, by emotional intelligence leading to better leadership qualities?
So he was I would say more than spiritual, he was a religious man. I think yes, he was spiritual, but he was a religious man. He was a religious Hindu. So when I went to his archives, for example, he was interested in astronomy. So mapping out stars, so his mathematical interest came in that, but he was also interested in astrology, right? So he had various Hindu charts, right time for anything. As is well known, he hung out with a lot of gurus, right? Some like Chandaswami, who are, to put it mildly, dubious, right? I mean, look, I liked him. I spent a lot of time interviewing him, but who am I kidding, right? He saw India as, as having Hindu and Muslim communities. I think he wasn't an English-speaking liberal at all, right? And there's a big caveat to that. He was not even an inch of an anti-Muslim human being. That is an absolute canard, He understood Islam more than most Indians because he grew up in Nizam's Hyderabad. He knew Persian. He had an understanding of Arabic. He could write Urdu. I think he was the top Urdu writer in Nizam's Hyderabad during that period. He grew up with Muslims, right? I wouldn't want to draw from his spirituality and his obvious religiosity that because he was, such a strong Hindu in that sense, he was anti-Muslim. Absolutely not. And that didn't shape his politics at all, right? I think that's a later canard. But I think it's certainly true that his religiosity and spirituality led him to underestimate the BJP. I think that is a correct sentence, right? Because he was like, look, I'm a Hindu, I know the Vedas, I know the scriptures, who are these fellows waving saffron flags? So he had a bit of a contemptuous view of them without understanding the politics of the BJP and its relationship to the Hindu religion. But 100%, it's impossible to understand him without seeing the religious and spiritual side to him.
Another question, but there's a two-part question. One is asking about why the Congress didn't appreciate Rao, and I think you've answered that already. But the first part is, who do you find more influential and more determined, Modi or Narasimha Rao? I don't know if you want to perhaps compare the two leaders.
So it's hard. I'll tell you why it's hard for me to compare, because one is a lot of what I understood about Narasimha Rao, I only understood with the benefit of hindsight, right? A lot of those changes were not evident then, and as Dinyar will tell you, this is the, historians or political scientists looking at the recent past or the past. You only figure this out much after the event takes place, right? You only get a reappraisal, that kind of thing. So I think it'll take, maybe a decade or two after Modi leaves, right, for us to have a sense of the impact of his government and the features of the leadership qualities, But I could think of some very obvious differences. Of course, the big one is that Modi is a mass leader, Narasimha Rao was not, and that Modi has complete control of the party, which has complete control of parliament. Neither is true in Narasimha Rao's case, right? I think one difference is, to Narasimha Rao's credit, is he had much more administrative experience. Like, he understood a lot of things that were not possible in India, in a way in which I think Modi simply didn't. I mean, Narasimha Rao would never have done something like demonetization. He would not, his idea was, you must make changes, but those changes have to be incremental. It has to be silent. This big budget announcing on television, that wasn't Narasimha Rao's style at all. The other thing that I think Narasimha Rao had, and it's not just in comparison with Modi, I would say in comparison with most leaders, is that Narasimha Rao was not insecure. And as a consequence, he had around him a lot of technocrats and even politicians who knew more than him, right? So he didn't feel that, that the finance minister should know less than me, otherwise I'll look bad, right? He said, no, look, finance is not something I know much about, right? He asked PC Alexander this. I realize that India has an economic crisis. Tell me the names of certain economists who understand how to open up India's economy, right? And the first name was IG Patel, and the second name was, as you all know, Dr. Manmohan Singh, right? Manmohan Singh knew much more about the economy than Narasimha Rao. I think he was much more of a conviction liberalizer than Narasimha Rao. Narasimha Rao was a hesitant liberalizer. But there you have it. He never felt insecure because Manmohan Singh knew more than him. And if you look at a lot of his appointments, they were, in foreign policy, for example, Narasimha Rao didn't ask the question, is this person loyal to me, as the only criteria for selection, And I think that distinguishes himself from most politicians that I have studied. And, just to add, in my second book, I look at Vajpayee and Advani. I think to some extent, Vajpayee had that trait too. He wasn't an insecure man on these issues. He was insecure in other ways, but not on these issues.
I'm going to ask you a counterfactual question. So if Rao had not been there in 1991, if Rajiv Gandhi had lived, or if Rao's, if Rao was in power and his rivals were able to eject him from power and take over as prime minister, what do you think would have happened? I mean, what was the consensus towards economic reform in that era amongst, really, as you point out over here, kind of the dominant, the dominant bloc of the Congress? So
that's a very good question, Dinyar. It's a counterfactual, so I can't say for sure. Nonetheless, I have an answer I feel strongly about, right? Even though the answer is based, it's a counterfactual, so I can never be sure, which is that I don't think we would have seen even a remote, this kind of change even slightly. I think you would have seen a little more as usual. Consider the counterfactuals, right? Which is, it's true that in June 1991, India had an economic crisis. But India had an even bigger economic crisis in 1981, right? So much so that we had to get a loan from the International Monetary Fund, which at the time was the biggest loan the IMF had given anybody, right? That didn't spur Indira Gandhi to bring about structural reforms in the economy. In '66, there was a crisis. So India, because the essential structure of the relationship between the state and the economy was flawed, every dozen years you would have serious crisis in the Indian economy, right? And the politician would always do something that was a little bit of a band-aid without any serious structural changes, right? And so I'm not convinced that the reason why 1991, 30 years from now, was different was because of external circumstances alone. Yes, it was significant, right? But many such, Indian politicians never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity, right? And many such opportunities had been provided for before, right? So let's get a little more specific on that question, Dinyar. Had Rajiv lived, what would have happened? I don't think much, because actually Rajiv was much more of a conviction liberalizer than Narasimha Rao. The problem is he just lacked the political ability to get it through. Think about it. Here was a man who had the highest majority in parliamentary history, right? And after basically Beaufort, Shah Bano, the opening of the locks of the Babri Masjid, he was reduced to complete weakling, right? Because he didn't understand the politics of how to get things done in India. On the other hand, if any of the competitors to Narasimha Rao had become prime minister, Sharad Pawar, ND Tiwari, I think you would have had more of the same thing. You know, Sharad Pawar, you would have had more crony capitalism. ND Tiwari, you may have had more crony socialism. But the decisive break, I think none of them would have been able to do the way he did. And I think it really was a case of a right man in the right job. This is not to diminish the circumstances. They matter. But in this particular case, I think leadership was that extra, the extra vitamin that brought about the transformation.
Great. Bhumesh is congratulating you for being longlisted for the Chattopadhyay Prize, and is asking you also, when are you expected to release Rao's voluminous archives? I know they're not in your possession, but perhaps you can tell us a bit about the papers.
Thanks, Bhumesh. It's a good question. I think about this question a lot. First, as Dinyar said, I don't own it, right? It's owned by the Narasimha Rao family, right? They were kind enough to give me access, but they have it with them and they are the legal owners, right? So all I can do is make requests, right? And the one dream I had when I wrote this book in 2016 is it will soon be digitized online, right? Because, to be made public, you can now, like, think about Mahatma Gandhi, right? Like, everything he wrote is online. So you can sit in Wisconsin or Moscow and write a very good book on Mahatma Gandhi based on primary archives, right? So I requested the family, I've requested the government of Telangana, I've requested chief ministers that please, instead of building a mausoleum to him, in the heart of like Hyderabad, just invest some money in an online digital archive. Of course, some of the material there are sensitive. So some of the things I also did mention, if they're really personal, sensitive matters that I think you all know what I'm alluding to. But even so, I think it makes a huge difference to scholars, right? It hasn't happened, right? I'm sad it hasn't happened. Unfortunately, I don't call the shots here. I can only make requests. It hasn't happened, and I'm happy you asked me this question, because if my voice goes even a little bit towards pushing it in the arc of kind of opening it up online, digitized and readable, right? That you can actually search, because there's a lot of material there. Now even handwriting searchability and all is very advanced, right? I think it will do more for his legacy than frankly my book did, and certainly building like one Pataliputra for him in the middle of Hyderabad will do, But sadly, I think this argument goes against the political economy of remembering politicians,
It's a problem that all of us face who write history. India has had a very patchy record on archives, and so much important archival material, even Government of India records, are in the hands of private people. It's a shame. And, Rao is a good example of someone who, the government should have stepped in over here and done something to properly preserve and disseminate the papers. And hopefully we still will have that opportunity for the future. So one question on what is the most powerful influence on Rao's political thinking beyond Vajpayee? I guess perhaps you can talk a little bit about Rao and Vajpayee's personal relationship as well there.
No, I don't think Rao was influenced by Vajpayee. I don't think that's a right sentence. I mean, Narasimha Rao was a product of the Congress system. Vajpayee was fundamentally a product of the RSS Hindu nationalist system. To the extent that in his early years, the parliamentary Vajpayee was influenced by Nehru, but I wouldn't want to overstate that. He was fundamentally an RSS man, or rather fundamentally a political Hinduism man, Jan Sangh and then BJP. I think similarly, the rather than asking a single answer to Narasimha Rao, I think the journey shaped the destination. As I mentioned, one of his traits, the fact that he had a multiplicity of experiences and the ability to weave it together. I think that is the thing, so he was influenced by the fact that he had been state minister in Andhra Pradesh. He was influenced by the fact that he was also chief minister of Andhra Pradesh. He was influenced by the fact that he had spent 1 decade as union minister in India, right? He was influenced by the fact that, he could read and write many different languages. So I think Narasimha Rao, since he was very old when he became prime minister and very experienced, it's hard to reduce him to a single sort of ideological frame or a worldview, right? So, for example, certainly the anti-Nizam struggle in Hyderabad played a role in influencing the early Narasimha Rao. But by the time he became prime minister, he had changed significantly, right? And as a biographer, and I'm sure Dinyar had the same thing to juggle when he was dealing with Dadabhai Navroji. When you deal with great human beings who live complex and large lives, it's hard to reduce the influences to a mathematical equation,
And I think it's important also to note that those influences change dramatically over time. Both Rao and Navroji were people who lived extremely long lives, and different influences are important at different stages and oftentimes diametrically opposed influences are important at different times.
Yeah. But it's a good question because, as a biographer, sometimes I said, look, is there a golden key, and sometimes there might be, but, certainly in Narasimha Rao's case, there wasn't. To give you an example where I think there is a bit of a golden key, my next book was on Vajpayee and Advani, Jugalbandi, BJP before Modi. And I would certainly say that the defining influence of Advani's life is partition, that a very rich English-speaking cosmopolitan Sindhi is suddenly kicked out of home, loses everything, and, family enters India in near penury, right? And he spent the rest of his life trying to kind of reunite India in his mind. So in his case, I would say there would be a clear influence, of course, many other things, but I think that is a defining one in a way in which I don't think for Narasimha Rao was the case.
So we have a question about whether Rao understood the implication of implicating several top Congress leaders in the Jain Hawala case. Might this have been a factor in the reason for the loss of the Congress in 1996?
So I don't think it was a reason for the loss of the Congress in 1996. I don't think so, right? I mean, the Congress was anyway in decline, frankly, if you ask me. Had Rajiv Gandhi not died, in the middle of the elections of 91, the BJP would have done better. You may have had a Prime Minister Advani then, would have been unstable. So 96 elections just showed that, Narasimha Rao left the political fortunes of the Congress as badly or as well as what he inherited, right? But in that time, he transformed India. So I don't think that the Jain Hawala diary played a role in the loss, right? I think you could make the argument that Narasimha Rao in, I think, January 96 allowed the CBI, rather than a conspiracy, allowed the CBI to sort of, in the charge sheet to the Supreme Court, mention the names of these politicians because he wanted to give the impression of being Mr. Clean, right? And as Mr. Clean goes, he will even allow the targeting of his own partymen, right? And I think the gambit didn't work. I think the lasting contribution of Jain Hawala case is lots of senior Indian politicians, from Advani to Madhav Rao Scindia, if my memory serves, to Arjun Singh, again, if my memory serves, did everything they could to take revenge on Narasimha Rao later on, right? But I don't think it, either had a lasting impact on Indian political economy or, frankly, was the cause of the 96 defeat.
We have a question asking you to compare Manmohan Singh with Rao in terms of who was more of the driving force in terms of economic reform. And if that's too difficult for you to answer, perhaps you can talk a little bit about the relationship between the two.
No, it's a simple question, and the book gives you a simple answer, which is Narasimha Rao, right? And here's why. I've interviewed Dr. Singh many times. I like him. He himself is understated, But the question to ask when saying who is to clearly, Manmohan Singh deserves enormous amounts of credit for liberalization, right? As does Amarnath Verma, who was the principal secretary of Narasimha Rao, as does Narasimha Rao, right? So there's no question of diminishing Manmohan Singh's contribution. And as I pointed out, Narasimha Rao was neither a conviction liberalizer nor did he understand economics, right? No doubt, right? But here's the bottom line, which we need to figure out before answering the question that you asked, which is, what is the single biggest driver of liberalization, right? Is it a question of ideas, having the blueprint, right? Or is it the political ability to implement those ideas? That's the question, right? And I argue in the book that blueprints, while important, is not the driver, because many of those blueprints were made in the early 80s, the mid 80s, and even the new industrial policy was written in a previous government, right? And the Yashwant Sinha budget, he was the finance minister of the previous government, that he was going to deliver was basically 50 to 60% of what Dr. Manmohan Singh delivered in June 91, right? So the question was, the ideas do make sense, but the ideas don't explain 91, because the ideas had been brewing for a long time. What was different was the political ability to get it through the Congress party, get it through parliament, get it through the public. That is what defines the liberalization process in India. And if you buy that argument, there's no debate that the person to primarily credit is Narasimha Rao himself, with Dr. Manmohan Singh and Amarnath Verma playing very, very important starring roles, you know.
Another question is asking if it's fair to conclude that 1991 was equally as significant as 1947 in the history of independent India.
I think so. I actually think so, you know, because what 1991 did was, it did many things, right? It reoriented India's foreign policy. It reoriented India's welfare schemes, of course, on the economy. It led to a lot of growth, huge reduction in poverty. But I think more than that, it reoriented the relationship between society and the state, you know, in deep ways, not just that privatization, liberalization, in pretty deep ways. So I would say, I mean, rather than saying, is it as important as 1947? I mean, of course, 1947 was not just a new vision for India, it was the end of colonial rule, right? I mean, they're two different things, right? It's not just the beginning of Nehruvian India, it's the end of colonial rule. So it's hard to compare the moment of independence, which, you know, has no rival. But I would certainly put it this way, that after 1947, the signal moment of India is 1991. And that Narasimha Rao's ability to buy political consensus for the changes he made meant that every prime minister, broadly including the current one, has operated within what I would like to call the Narasimha consensus. So there's a Nehru consensus, and then there's a Narasimha consensus, especially on issues of welfare, economy, and foreign policy.
Someone is asking you about the type of books that Rao read.
Well, so so that's a good question. So the only way I know is if I go to his library, what all did I see, right? He read a lot of religious fiction and a lot of religious literature, you know. And I think the fiction that he read tended to be in Telugu and Hindi and Marathi, the fiction, right, for fun. But in English, he read boring policy books, right? He enjoyed that, you know, reading, taking notes, making notes in the margin. After the 1980s, because he was suddenly made foreign minister of India, primarily because he knew nothing of foreign policy. That's why he was made foreign minister in 1980 or 81, I forget when. And since then, he developed friendships with professors in, say, the US, who would regularly send him printouts of recent articles. The photograph that you saw that I sent was one such, Clash of Civilization, written in 1993. And I think within a year, Narasimha Rao was reading it and making notes. So he was quite up to date, you know. But certainly his reading for pleasure, he would not read like Sidney Sheldon. He would read, you know, Telugu or Hindi or Marathi books.
I guess the really fascinating thing about him is not only was he reading in different languages, but he was reading different genres in different languages. That's, I mean, that's remarkable to think of. What is your next project? You've written on Rao. You know, you wrote your second book on the BJP before Modi. What's the next project you're looking at?
I'm looking for ideas. So currently, I'm in entrepreneurship mode, right? Because again, as Dinyar will tell you, not only do you have to have an idea, and in my case, it's very important that the idea sells, right? Both books have been bestsellers because I relentlessly ask the question, you know, that, what do readers enjoy, right? Academics don't like me asking that question, but whatever, right? But third feature to do an idea is that there has to be research material available. Either there has to be documents or people have to speak. You may have a great idea that, that people may also enjoy, but the material isn't there. And so at least the academic within me balks when that happens, you know. So the short answer is I'm still looking. Right now, the US edition of my second book has just come out. So I'm kind of, promoting that, and various language translations are coming out. So I'm just spending this year just seeing whether different ideas have some meat to them,
And it's strange how a lot of times these ideas of what our next projects are going to be, they kind of come like a bolt of lightning. I mean, I remember precisely when the particular structure for my book on Nauroji came. I mean, it came at a particular moment before a particular conference while I was trying to figure out what I was going to say, and things fall in place after that. So we have about time for maybe one lengthy question. And I'm going to combine one question by a faculty member here, Malay Krishna, with something I wanted to ask you also. So Malay asks, what would Rao do if he came to power in 2024? What would be the biggest issues that he would seek to address? And that kind of builds into the question I want to ask you, which is, for the past 10 years or so, we've seen a moment in Indian history where a lot of political and economic analysts have said that the program of reform has really slowed down. And it's lost steam, and in many cases, it's we're backsliding to a certain degree. What particular lessons can Rao's life and career offer us at this particular moment?
So on what would Narasimha Rao do if he was a candidate in 2024? Look, that's really hard for me to answer because, I know as much as you do, right? Like, just because I understood how he operated in 91 to 96, I can't claim confidence that I can understand how he'll operate in a different context because, as a biographer, I can tell you your subject sometimes surprises you, right? The second reason why I'm a little hesitant is, look, in 1991, the nature of the crisis was crystal clear, right? It was crystal clear that Punjab and Kashmir and parts of the Northeast were just seceding from India. It was clear, right? It was clear that the Soviet Union had fallen. It was clear that we didn't have enough money to pay for our oil imports, right? And given this clarity, right? And perhaps this clarity I now see, maybe if you were talking in June 91, some of these would be clear, some of these won't. Narasimha Rao's genius was once he understood with clarity the crisis, he could maneuver the political system like no other, right? I think the answer to the first question is difficult because, I don't think the 6 or 7 of us or, 26 of us will agree about the nature of the crisis in India right now, right? Many people think India is doing well. Some people think India is doing badly, right? So that's why I would be a little hesitant to answer that question, right? Because it involves first defining what the current problem is, and I'm just less sure about it. And maybe my skill sets don't extend to that. It only extends to 20 years later. So maybe 20 years later, I can answer that question. Now, what are some of the things you could learn from Narasimha Rao, given his personality traits? I would definitely say that the ability to hire talented people around you and back them 100%, right? He wasn't secretive in that sense. He didn't prize loyalty. Only 3-4 people should know. No, he didn't operate like that. That's just not how I think that's a very important skill set. The ability, that in a country like India, you have to take different segments of India along with you, different segments of society, different segments of the state. He would reach out to the opposition regularly. Now, you could argue that Modi doesn't have to do it because he's a majority. And Narasimha Rao had to do it because he was a minority. But I think because he was a minority, he understood that the mandate is a limited one per force, right? And so in that sense, I think the second thing you can learn from him is a deep sense of humility about what is possible and what is achievable while still being a person of action. So I'm not saying humility that makes you frozen, right? Or paralyzed, right? But a humility in that you are not God, your mandate is limited, right? There are plenty of other people who are also popular. And to the extent, let's see whether we can take them along. If you can't take them along, you still make the decision. But act, right? It's not that don't act. It's not that just do consensus. But keep in mind that a country as diverse, as different, with so many different levers as India, change lasts when you take lots of sectors of society alongside you. I think that's the other deeper lesson I think that Narasimha Rao shows us.
That's exactly what I tell my students in courses that I teach on history also. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really important lesson to emphasize at this particular moment. So with that, we are out of time. I really want to thank Vinay for being here and talking about his book, not just Half Line, but also talking about Jugalbandi, which has recently come out as well. And both books really, aside from shining important lights on three really important people in the past few decades of history, they're useful and really essential for understanding the larger picture of how India has evolved politically and economically up to the current moment that we've seen so far. So they're very timely books in that regard. So I'll just mention before we close that the next event that the Center for Wisdom and Leadership is hosting in this book series is an event with Danish and Ruhi Khan, who will be joining us from London. They've written a book called Escaped, which talks about certain fugitives, financial fugitives who, people like Vijay Mallya and such, who've escaped to London. And they'll be joining us on the 15th of October from 6 to 7 p.m. You can find details on the Center for Wisdom and Leadership's website. Thank you to everyone for joining us and have a good rest of the day.
Thank you, Dinyar. Thank you, Professor Tahura. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Ranjini, for helping organizing this. Thank you very much. I had an absolutely great time.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.